now Q&A. So please, we'll take 3 or 4 questions together. Please come to the microphone. Quickly identify yourself. Since we only have 30 minutes, please do raise your questions quickly.
Hi, I'm Nigel Lee, and I go to the Singapore American School. You guys brought up the fact about Russia and their assertiveness within geopolitics around the world. Regardless of these harsh sanctions that were imposed over the past years, Russia has continued to exert their hegemony in Ukraine, in Syria. So what does the panel propose could be an alternative to how we could foster cooperation with Russia or even with China, and poses that question?
Great. Okay, maybe Sebastian will answer that, okay? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was a great honor to listen to it. So I have a question about the 777 formula, and I have a question about the distribution of veto. So right now, all the 5 great powers, they have veto. And by the formula which you introduced, I really have a question about how the veto will work in this formula. Because as I see it, the more countries you bring into this formula, the more disbalanced it looks. So the question is about the veto.
Okay, thank you. Good question. Any more questions? Okay, then let's quickly go to the first round. Sebastian, you want to answer the question on Russia?
Because I'm not a Russia expert, I will answer this question with respect to the Security Council. The effectiveness of the Security Council is always, to some degree, a reflection of the real-world relations among the permanent 5 members. And as you've heard from me and Simon, during much of the Cold War, the Security Council was largely paralyzed because of the Cold War standoff. But it's interesting to remember that even during the Cold War, the Security Council at times served as a very helpful body to avert superpower confrontation and to provide a forum for the great powers to hash out an agreement on issues that may, in the absence of the existence of the Security Council, actually have escalated. And very interestingly and unknown, the Cuban Missile Crisis is among them, and here in particular the Secretary General Uthand, who was only the acting Secretary General at times, served as a helpful go-between, offering Russia and the US both a back channel and a compromise solution that gave them both a ladder to climb down from maximalist demands. And I think that is also an important lesson for today, as relations between the US and Russia in particular have deteriorated. There is an important role both for the Security Council and for the Secretary General. I think in terms of, even today, I think the Security Council has played an important role in fostering cooperation among Russia and the US, in spite of their very tense standoff in a number of issues. One of them is, as I mentioned, the counterterrorism agenda. Just last December, there was a big new resolution in the Security Council that refocused a sanctions regime that was originally created focusing on Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and then globalized to reflect the spread of Al-Qaeda well beyond Afghanistan, and refocused this very much on ISIL. So even though you have this deep disagreement among Moscow and Washington on how to approach Syria, one thing they agree on is that ISIL is bad. And this creates quite a bit of cooperation in the Security Council. So for the Security Council, it's important for the great powers to continue to look for potential areas of cooperation, which I think will help de-escalate current tensions.
Maybe I can just throw in, well, just on the sanction. None of the sanctions imposed on Russia are UN sanctions, and that's the deal of the veto. The veto tells the great powers, and this is the reason that they joined the UN in the first place, you have an ironclad guarantee that these powerful tools we're creating will never be used against you. And even other sanctions regimes against Russia are not that strong. I mean, if the financial sanctions could be stronger, but London doesn't want that because London's a major financial centre. Military sanctions could be stronger, but France doesn't want that because of relationship. You could cut off natural gas, but that would be Europe suffering. So for all these reasons, I think it's very hard to see how to put pressure on Russia through pure sanctions, and I think the constructive engagement is probably more realistic at this point.
Francesco?
Yeah, if I can add 2 cents on that. To stress the importance of keeping a channel of conversation open on Syria. There are, of course, good reason to do that independently from US and Russia relationship. But I think it is also essential to have this dialogue, because that's a place where a conversation can still happen between the two countries. And so I think there is a point to keep going to Geneva or to Vienna, even if we can't find really an agreement on a ceasefire, because it helps to keep a dialogue going. And I think this is one of the function of the Council in broadly, conflict solution tools.
Okay, let me make 3 quick points in response to the veto question. Firstly, I mean, in theory, a veto is bad, right? Why should some countries have the right to veto and others don't have it? It seems immoral, unequal, and it's fashionable to call for the veto to be abolished. But as I mentioned in the introduction to my remarks, I think it's actually good that the great powers have the veto, because it gives them a stake in the Security Council, it gives them a stake in staying on in the United Nations. It also ensures that you don't do a stupid thing like declaring war on a great power. Because if you did that, then obviously you're going to lose. Right? So it's good for if the United States is really unhappy about something, it's better for the United States to use its veto and says, back off. So then the world backs off. I think that's why the veto is actually a very important signaling mechanism. To say that don't deal with the vital interests of this great power. The second point is on the veto is that, everyone talks about the formal veto, but frankly the informal veto is far more powerful. The formal vetoes, you only have a dozen or so, maybe in a year. Informal vetoes, you have thousands every day. And let me give you an example of an informal veto. The head of the World Court once came to the UN and said, I want to give a briefing to the UN Security Council on the work of the World Court. Now, I thought the World Court is a wonderful institution. They want to come and give a briefing to the UN Security Council. Everybody will say yes. So Singapore was president of the UN Security Council. I conducted informal consultations. I said, good news, friends, the president of the World Court wants to give us a briefing. So the United States said, no, we object. So I said, then why? Well, the United States has got some problems with the World Court. I said, okay. I said, well, this is a procedural issue. So why don't we have a vote on this? And the US delegate says, oh, the question is whether or not it's a procedural issue, it's a substantive issue. And therefore we can veto. And so effectively the United States was never official, vetoed the presentation by the President of the World Court. But these are examples of thousands of vetoes that happen every time in the Security Council. That's something that we should study more. The third and final point is that, when you have more permanent members, it will make life more difficult. That's true. But that's also a fact of international life. You have to deal with the great powers of the day, because if you, at some point in time, if you don't get the great powers of tomorrow in the UN Security Council, and they stay outside the UN Security Council, they will just delegitimize and kill it. And that's why you have to bring in the great powers of tomorrow in a reformed Security Council. You have to deal, at the end of the day, the Security Council must reflect the great power realities of our times. If it doesn't, it's not relevant. So, next question. Please, come to the mic and...
Thank you for your presentation. My question is...
Again, if you don't mind, identify yourself for the...
my name is Giacomo, and I'm a second-year Master of Public Policy student here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. My question is, you talk about the possibility for Security Council reform, but to be successful, would it not need reform in other international organizations? For example, if you give a position to the European Union as a permanent member, the European Union would need to change the way it acts or it works in order to be an effective member of the Security Council. So do you see this as a reform process that links to other organizations?
Okay, good question. I guess I have to answer that, yes. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, I am Lim Shishun from this Asia Competitiveness Institute in LKOSPP. My question is about the effectiveness of the UN Security Council, and really the recent terrorist attacks via Einsiedel, Boko Haram, and so on, have actually threatened quite a number of states, and the intervention of the United Nations Security Council doesn't seem to be as quick in terms of responding, unlike in the case of Libya, where the UN Security Council actually quickly moved into action. So there's this concept of individuals, of the UN, doing the military application of the responsibility to protect, which is a new norm by UN members to try to protect mass atrocities. So in that case, would any type of better responses can be performed by the UN Security Council to combat the increasing threats, to protect the international vulnerable civilians? Thank you.
Okay. Maybe Simon, you can take care of Simon. Yeah. Next question.
I'm Ruben Hintz. I'm a student here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I have a question for Professor Chesterman about the regional rotation of the Secretary General. The last 3 Secretary Generals have been from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And now there's some discussion about how it's Eastern Europe's turn. I wonder if you think this is now an actual informal rotation, and then what comes after Eastern Europe.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Wing Hong, and I work for a non-profit. I'm quite interested in your suggestion that you adopt a 777 model as an alternative to the current composition to the UN Security Council. I'm a bit intrigued about some of the choices with regards to the 7 permanent members. I think having Russia, US, China, and EU is a bit of a no-brainer. But the rest, like Brazil, Nigeria, I think the rationale behind this is that, it seems to me at least, is that because these countries are the most populous countries in their respective regions. But I would like to know that we should take priority in the selection as to who gets to be a permanent member of the Security Council. Should it be based on a country's substantive capabilities and actual hard power characteristics, or on the basis of whether which country is more populous and and therefore more qualified to be in the council? Thank you.
Okay, I guess I have to respond to that. Next question.
Good evening. I'm Dmytro Senik, Ukrainian ambassador. First of all, thank you, the authors, for such a timely bringing limelight to the UNSC phenomena. And I would like just to remind everyone that some countries forget that veto, echoing the veto issue, is not a privilege, rather obligation or responsibility. And with developments that Russia causes now in Ukraine and in Georgia before, putting veto on the issues where Russia is a part of the conflict, which actually goes in contradiction with the Article 27, the third para. By the way, the UNSC was kind of shying away of considering that issue. So basically, the phenomenon of veto should be reconsidered, I think, and in a way, I like the idea of 777. Maybe there would not be a veto by one country when 21 is involved. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, last question, then we come to the panel.
First and foremost, at the outset, thank you for the insights. My question is actually targeted to Mr. Sebastian. It is in regards to, I wanted to know your thoughts on what are your views on ICJ testing the validity and legality of the Security Council resolutions. Thank you.
Okay, so Simon, I think you got 2 questions. I don't know whether Francesco, you want to tackle the question posed by the ambassador of Ukraine. And then Sebastian, you got a question on the ICJ, and I'll answer the 2 questions about selection of the new permanent members. So go ahead, okay. Simon.
Because Kishore, you get $7 every time someone says 7-7, don't you?
Simon, do you want to take the ICJ question actually, because I think more yours.
Sure. Okay, so I'll take the ICJ question as well, if you like. The ICJ question is reasonably simple. It's completely unrealistic. I can see the attraction, but the ICJ is not set up as a constitutional court. It was explicitly set up as one of 6 equal entities. And so it's not meant to adjudicate on the Security Council. The Security Council could refer a matter to the ICJ and has done that once. I think it was Namibia. But just an example of how the ICJ operates, it can take years for the ICJ to reach decisions, and so the idea of it reviewing a Security Council decision on an ongoing basis would be very difficult. That doesn't mean that the Security Council operates outside the law. The Ukrainian ambassador's reference to the Charter is an indication of how the Security Council still has to operate within a framework of the rule of law, but the check, and this is one of the problems with international law, the check is not if the Council oversteps its authority, a constitutional court steps in, police arrive, lock people up, shutter the institution. The check is that people stop paying attention. And I think one example of that with the veto power can be seen in terms of the way in which the different powers have changed in their use. There is a reason that Britain and France have not used a veto in the 21st century, and that's that it would be seen as crazy. Like Britain and France, who do you think you are exercising a veto power? There is also a reason why China has now started using its veto power, because it's seen as unhelpful, but it's also seen as something that great powers do. Okay, the question about effectiveness of the council. Why Libya? Why is it easy to act in Libya? Why is it harder to act elsewhere? Libya was in many ways a unique case. You rarely have a leader who is so crazy, who is so explicitly saying that by this date I'm going to wipe out this town Benghazi in a reasonably spread out country where it looks like you would have a reasonable chance of bringing about a victory on the ground without having to have a massive ground troop presence, and you have it in an environment where there is one of these windows of Security Council unanimity. I mean, Libya is interesting partly because China abstained, I think, on the resolution authorising the operation, but China actually voted in favour of referring the Libyan situation to the International Criminal Court. And the reason was partly the Security Council was getting along at that point, but also because I think it was the Organisation of the Islamic Conference was unanimous in its support of a similar operation.
And Arab League.
And the Arab League in particular as well, yes, thanks. So that's why you could get action on Libya. Why can't you get action elsewhere? Okay, in theory, it would be very clear what you should do with the Security Council is considering a problem. You have a political problem on the ground. What do you need? You need 4 things. You need a clear political plan to get from A to B. You need a mandate to achieve that aim, getting from A to B. You need resources to complete the plan to get from A to B, and you need no vetoes. In theory, that's what should happen in that order. In reality, it's the exact opposite. Anyone want a veto? Okay, it's off the table. No one wants to veto? Okay, how much resources, political capital, money, people are we prepared to put to this? Let's cobble together a mandate, and then let's see if we can get to a political resolution. So unfortunately, that's what often happens, and unless it's a priority, it's very rare for the Security Council to authorise something unless it has resources and political will to follow through on it. Lastly for me, the question on regional rotation. This is interesting, not least because it's an example of how countries, as our Ukrainian friend has pointed out, have had great difficulties, but one thing that Ukraine and Russia could agree on is that it's Eastern Europe's turn. So good that they're agreeing on that, although obviously they disagree about most other things. Is there really a norm for regional rotation? That's very hard to argue because although ASEAN is an organisation that does rotate, the Secretary General moves in alphabetical order through the countries, but that's partly because the Secretary General is very weak. The Secretary General of the UN, it was broadly accepted when Kofi Annan had a second term that it would next be Asia's turn. It is plausible from the Eastern Europe position that Eastern Europe is the only regional grouping that's never had a Secretary General, but half the members of the Eastern European group are either members or aspirant members of the European Union and or NATO. So does Eastern Europe really make sense as a regional entity? That's a question. The resolution, the General Assembly resolution that was adopted in 2006 on the selection of the Secretary General said that due regard should be had to regional representation or regional rotation and gender equality. And it wasn't clear at the time whether this was meant to either privilege gender equality or deprivilege regional rotation. But even the Eastern Europeans now are arguing that the next Secretary General should be Eastern European, and then it doesn't matter anymore because then everyone's had a Secretary General. Candidly, I think there's probably more energy to appoint a female Secretary General than there is definitely an Eastern European Secretary General, although it's highly likely, if you had to bet on someone, that you would bet on an Eastern European woman.
Great. Francesco, you want to add?
Sure, yes, no, it's a quick, you pointed out to a very important aspect of the Charter, which is very rarely invoked, which is this Article 27.3, in which, in theory, a country should abstain from voting on a matter that concern its own national interest. This is an article that has never really been invoked, with one exception, which in 1960, when Argentine was a member of the Council and abstained from voting from the capture of Israel Eichmann on his own territory. And that was a discussion about the violation of the sovereignty, territorial sovereignty of Argentina. Otherwise, never been invoked. So, you know, here we are. They pick and choose. However, I would still claim that, as unfair it is in certain situations, my fear is that without a veto, major powers will simply walk away. They will simply ignore and walk away. And of course, we do have an historical precedent, which is the League of Nations. And so we talk a lot about the relevance of the Security Council, but I think one of the reasons why the Council still remain relatively relevant is actually there is a veto, and as Kishore just mentioned, major powers do have a vested interest to engage, as unfair as that might be, particularly in certain contexts.
Let me take some scraps from here and there. So there was a question on whether other organizations wouldn't need to reform first for a Security Council reform to be workable. I think that's probably true with respect to your 777 formula and your assertion that the EU would need to merge their seat into one EU seat, because in spite of the fact that on paper there is a common security and foreign policy, in reality we're not quite there yet. And on key issues...
You just gave away a big secret.
Especially on key issues on the Security Council's agenda over the past 10 years, France and UK and the EU in general have been split. But let me turn this question around: is the absence of reform of other multilateral organizations shows us what may be in store for the Security Council if it doesn't reform. And here I'm referring in particular to the IFIs, where the governance of which remains heavily dominated by Western countries. And China and others have long pushed for reform, and the absence of the IFIs to reform have led China in particular to actually set up competitive alternative arrangements elsewhere. And I think the same we may see with respect to the Security Council. And I absolutely agree with you that if the Security Council does not reform, its legitimacy and therefore also its effectiveness will be undermined. Where I do not agree with you, just to add a little contrarian note here, is that the solution lies in adding new vetoes. I think the veto is so deeply unpopular among the wider membership that it is widely seen among a mistake of 1945 to set up a system where a veto is given permanently, and the effect of which we see now, which is it makes reform so much more difficult. Which is why I think the alternative reform model that's on the table, namely just to create semi-permanent seats with no veto, is one that inherently has a greater chance to attract a two-thirds majority in the General Assembly, which you would need to amend the Charter than any reform model that foresees the addition of new veto powers.
Okay, let me quickly respond to the two questions, and then after that, if you don't mind, each one of us will get 1 minute at the end. I'll start with you, Simon, Francesco, Sebastian, myself, because we'll try and finish at 6:30. Now, the first question on you're absolutely right. The European Union will have to be changed before it can represent itself as a single entity under my 777 formula, and there'll be lots of difficulties, but at the same time, as Simon Chesterman mentioned, the British and the French are really scared about using their veto. And I think in private they know that their days are numbered on the Security Council. So if they want to find a creative way of retaining their influence in the UN Security Council, they'll have to come to some kind of a private deal whereby they'll give Germany an equal share in the decision making. So it'll be basically a German, UK, France triumvirate controlling the EU veto in the Security Council. Because, my response to the idea that you have a reformed Security Council where the old P5 keep their vetoes, UK and France keep their vetoes, and the new permanent members, India doesn't get a veto, is an absolute insult to India to say come in as a second-class member to UK and France as a first-class members in today's world. It won't work. Any Indian government that accepts a second-class status will be dead meat in India. It will be seen as insult to the country to accept that. So that's why it's politically not feasible to have that status. Now, the question as to why pick Brazil, India, and Nigeria and all that, basically, at the end of the day, as Sebastian mentioned, to get Security Council reform, you need 2/3 of the votes in the UN General Assembly. If you don't get the African group on, you don't get the Latin American group on, you don't get the Asian group on, you haven't got 2/3 of the UN General Assembly. So clearly, each of these regional groups must feel that they too get a permanent membership seat in the UN Security Council, and that's why you have to spread the veto among all regions in the world. It's a politically realistic thing to do. So we'll conclude with 1 minute each, starting with you, Simon.
Okay, so UN reform is often said to be like the weather. Everyone talks about it, no one can do anything about it. And the barriers to the sort of change that Kishore is highlighting are very high. They're not insurmountable. Reform of the Charter requires 2/3 of the General Assembly, including all the permanent members, but that's not the same as a veto. It might take time to get the permanent members on board, but it might be possible. But I'll just finish by saying there are informal ways of addressing some of these problems. And for example, on the EU seat, it's highly unlikely, if it would be hard for an Indian government to take a second-class seat, which British or French government is going to give up the veto? But they don't have to. You could have a scenario in which Britain and France come to an agreement where they will agree that one of them will always abstain and the other will always vote in accordance with EU common security and foreign policy. That would be conceivable. You've had previous examples of overlapping candidacies. Brazil and Argentina have worked together. So there are informal ways, and just on the veto, probably the thing that would make the biggest difference is if countries just had to give reasons. If there was a practice that you have to explain in serious terms why you're vetoing, that might be useful. The very last thing I'll say is about expectations, that we're talking about ambitious expectations for the UN, but since I quoted him earlier, Doug Hammarskjöld, the inventor of peacekeeping, I'll finish with him as well. That he, I think, summed up the purpose of the UN most accurately once, saying that the role of the United Nations is not to take humanity to heaven, but to save it from hell. And so that's the very low benchmark against which I measure the UN success or failure.
Francesco.
Yes, one quick comment, if you allow me, on the capacity of the European Union to coordinate their foreign policy decisions. They cannot even decide who can run from Europe on the non-permanent seat. And they constantly fight with each other, spending a lot of time, resources, and money to gain their non-permanent seats. And there is no way that in Brussels they can find a coordination and say, okay, we have the European running as a non-permanent seat. That would be already an attempt to kind of coordinate their role in the UN. two quick points. One, it's something that kind of percolated across here and there. I think it's important to stress when it comes to conflict resolution in the Council. It is the growing role of regional organizations and sub-regional organizations. We mentioned the Arab League for Libya. There are many other examples. I think in Cote d'Ivoire it was very important, the role of ECOWAS, which is a sub-regional organization of West Africa. I think this is a growing role. And so the conversation between the Council and this broad constellation of different regional organizations, it's something very important. There is Chapter 8 in the Council, in the UN Charter, one of the least developed and thought about chapter, and maybe more thinking should be done on how to develop those relationships. And finally, I would actually advocate for more role of the Council when it comes to stabilizing and solving conflict. I think one of the problems that I mentioned before is that the timeline of the Council is too brief. And what generally happens is that the Council walk away once either the violence is over or election has been run, at a very, very fragile and delicate moment in a country, and hand over the country to generally ill-equipped and ill-funded bodies of the UN, which are the development agencies. And I think this is something that has to change because, let's be honest, the money is in peacekeeping and in what the Council does. So unless there is an effort to strengthen the capacity of those agencies, I think the Council should maintain more long-term engagement in this country to work together with the host government on stabilizing them.
Sebastian?
Before I get to my final point, quick response to Simon's suggestion of having France and the UK basically share an EU voice role. In principle, a good idea, but in a situation like Libya, for instance, where the use of force authorization resolution 1973 was basically negotiated and voted upon under intense pressure within 24 hours, given the divisions within the EU, I think this may have paralyzed the Council in that particular situation. But the point I want to make is, I agree with you, Council reform is necessary. I agree with you, it will happen sometime. I don't agree with you that it will happen anytime soon. So the question becomes, what kind of reform can we look at that would actually arguably significantly increase the effectiveness of the UN with respect to the Council? And here I want to go back to something Simon said, and that's the fact that the mere fact that the Secretary General is dependent for his not only election but re-election on the consent of all permanent 5 members. One way to turn the Secretary General into a more effective and independent figure is to actually only have him to be elected for one term that lasts a little longer, one term of 7 years, because then he wouldn't be beholden with every decision he takes or she takes within the first 4 years to the whims of the P5. Now, it's nowhere written in the Charter that these have to be 2 terms of 5 years. Rather, a General Assembly could simply take the nominating resolution from the Security Council, in which they hopefully nominate a woman, and say, thank you for this recommendation. We will herewith elect this candidate for one term of 7 years. This is constitutionally possible, and in one fell swoop would both reassert the authority of the General Assembly vis-à-vis the Security Council, and would lead to a much more independent Secretary General.
Well, let me end quickly with 3 points. Firstly, I want to tell you all that as someone who served as an ambassador to the UN for 10 years, and therefore I'm reasonably well informed about UN matters, I learned so many new things from the discussion today. This has been an exceptionally rich discussion, and as I said, on the most important organization in the world. The second point I was going to make is that, I must say, after listening to all this, I must say I'm very torn in terms of whether or not I should be optimistic or pessimistic in terms of Security Council reform. So why don't I give one pessimistic point and one optimistic point? The pessimistic point, my second point, is that Singapore actually very bravely led an initiative called the S5 to push exactly what Simon suggested, get the P5 to explain their veto. That's all. Just explain your veto. You know what happened? The P5 crushed the S5. the initiative died. So that's about great power politics, and you can't avoid it. So my final point on a more optimistic note, and here I actually do believe that in general, the world is getting to be a better and better place, generally speaking. We don't have to worry about another World War III, by the way. The UN Charter succeeded. We have prevented World War III. So I suspect that if we can get more people like you, civil society, more engaged in dealing with questions which are so fundamental like the UN Security Council, and if all of you throw more light on what the P5 are doing, expose their shenanigans, then I think we might actually have a better Security Council in the years to come. So with that, now please join me in thanking this amazing panel.